the early hours of Monday, December 11th, 1978, a black van moved through the service roads near the cargo terminals at John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens, New York. The 6 men inside it wore ski masks. They wore gloves. They carried loaded weapons. One of them stepped out at a chain link gate and cut the padlock with a pair of bolt cutters, and then the crew walked through a door they opened with a key into a building whose floor plan they had studied for months, toward a vault whose security system had been explained to them in precise detail by the man who operated it every working day of his professional life. What followed took 64 minutes. In those 64 minutes, 9 Lufthansa Airlines cargo employees were gathered at gunpoint and told to lie on the floor of the lunchroom and not move. The cargo supervisor was separated from the others and escorted to the vault. The vault's alarm system required that one door be fully shut before a second could be opened without triggering a signal to the Port Authority police unit at the airport. The supervisor knew the sequence. The men in ski masks knew that he knew it. They gave him instructions and he followed them. The 10 by 20-foot room behind the vault doors contained what they had come for: bundled currency and containers of jewelry. The crew loaded the van and walked back out of the building they had entered with a key. At 4:21 in the morning, the van pulled away from building 261 and the men inside it drove toward Brooklyn carrying $5 million in untraceable cash and $875,000 in jewelry, the largest single cash robbery in the history of the United States. The money was never recovered. The man who planned the robbery was never charged with it. Within 7 months of that December morning, 9 of the people who helped make it possible were dead. A 10th would die years later. The only person ever convicted for the crime was an airport employee who had provided the inside information, and he had never been in the same room as the man at the center of the plan. That man had made sure of that. He had made sure of most things, for most of his life, and the careful management of who knew what and how much was not a habit he had developed for this particular job. It was simply how he had always operated. His name was James Burke. Everyone who knew him called him Jimmy the Gent. What he did in the months after December 11th, 1978, making the people who helped him disappear one by one until the case had no witnesses and no physical evidence that could connect him to anything, is one of the most coldly organized episodes in the history of American crime. And the story of how he built the world that made it possible begins not at an airport in Queens, but in a succession of foster homes across New York City, where a child who did not know either of his parents was learning, in the most unforgiving way available, that the world was not going to give him anything he did not take for himself. Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from. It is genuinely one of the most interesting parts of putting these together, seeing how far the reach goes. And if you are new and you want more history like this delivered directly to you, subscribe now. Back to Queens, and the man who pulled off the biggest heist in American history and then erased almost everyone who helped him do it. James Conway was born on July 5th, 1931 in New York City to a woman named Jane Conway, an Irish immigrant, and to a father whose identity was never established in any surviving record. Before he was 2 years old, his mother placed him in foster care. He never saw either of his natural parents again. The years that followed were not kind in any consistent way. He moved through a succession of Catholic orphanages and foster homes in the city, and in some of those places he was treated with something approaching ordinary human decency, and in others he was subjected to the kind of physical and sexual abuse that leaves a specific kind of mark on a person who has no power to choose where he lives or who has authority over him. He emerged from that period understanding, at a level that did not require articulation, that the institutional structures around him were not designed with his interests in mind, and that what protection existed in the world was the kind you built for yourself. In 1944, when James Conway was 13 years old, the foster father he was living with reached into the back seat of his car to strike the boy while driving, lost control of the vehicle, and died in the resulting crash. The man's widow survived, and she blamed the child, and she beat him regularly until he was removed from that household and sent somewhere else. He was eventually taken in by the Burke family of Rockaway, Queens, people who were consistently decent to him, people he would return to visit throughout his adult life and to whom he sent money in later years. He took their name, but the Burke family found him after the pattern had already been established, and the pattern did not change. He was in trouble with the law within months of the crash. Arrests accumulated through his mid-teens. He spent most of the period between the ages of 16 and 22 inside juvenile detention centers and federal prisons, with a documented gap of 86 days outside those institutions across all those years combined. What he was doing during his prison sentences was not merely serving time. He was performing violent work for both the Lucchese and Colombo crime families, which happened to have members in the same federal facilities he was cycling through, and he was building relationships with the men who ran those organizations from the inside. He was also building a reputation based on a single consistent fact. He did not cooperate with authorities. When he was questioned, he said nothing useful. When pressure was applied, he absorbed it and stayed quiet. In the world he was entering, that kind of silence was not one quality among many. It was the primary credential. His first significant arrest had come at 18, when he was caught passing approximately $3,000 in counterfeit checks on behalf of a man named Dominic Cersani, a figure connected to the Colombo family who went by the neighborhood nickname Remo. He was sentenced to 5 years at Elmira Reformatory. He served the time without providing anything to the authorities that would reduce it or transfer it to anyone else. When he came out and returned to the streets of Queens and East New York, he carried the things that incarceration in those institutions produced in the right kind of person: a network of contacts across multiple crime families, a working understanding of how the organizational structure operated and what it needed at every level, and a reputation for reliability that was, in the world he was entering, worth more than almost anything else. He was Irish. That fact did not change, and it meant that no matter what he earned, or what he controlled, or how many men around him recognized his authority, he could never be formally inducted into an Italian-American crime family. He would always be an associate, a man operating inside the structure without the specific institutional protections that full membership conferred. In another kind of man, this might have produced resentment or limitation. For James Burke, it produced something else: a freedom of movement across the organizational landscape that formally inducted members did not have, and a position that was harder for law enforcement to precisely locate and account for than the positions of the men above and beside him. He spent 3 decades using that position. He was very good at it. What he arrived at, as the 1950s progressed, was a specific neighborhood in South Ozone Park, a specific relationship with a Lucchese crime family capo regime named Paul Vario, who would structure his professional life for the next 3 decades, and a specific address on Lefferts Boulevard that would anchor his criminal operation through all of what came after. He was building a world, and the world he was building had a center. Robert's Lounge sat at 11445 Lefferts Boulevard in South Ozone Park, a narrow room on a street in Queens that was convenient to almost everything Burke needed it to be. It was a few miles from the cargo terminals at Kennedy Airport. It was accessible to the neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Queens where the cruise operations ran. It was a place where men who did not want to be observed in hotel lobbies or restaurant booths could conduct the kind of business that could not be written down. It had 3 card tables, a bar, a back area, and a basement. Burke also ran a dress factory next door, officially called Moo Moo Vetta's, which served the function that any legitimate-seeming business serves when it is owned by someone whose primary income cannot be reported to any government agency. The 2 operations together gave him a physical presence in the neighborhood that was unremarkable enough to be invisible. Paul Vario kept his world small and his circle tight, and his attention fixed on what was actually making money. He saw in Burke something that the federal agents who would spend decades trying to prosecute both men would also eventually recognize, though it took them considerably longer: a man of exceptional operational intelligence who understood the specific requirements of sustained criminal enterprise and who had no interest in visibility or reputation as ends in themselves. Their relationship operated within the formal structure of the Lucchese family, but along lines that gave Burke a degree of autonomy that strictly Italian associates rarely achieved. Vario treated him as a trusted lieutenant. Burke treated Vario as the man whose approval he needed for major operations and whose organizational protection he operated under, and the politics of the five families. Henry Hill arrived in Burke's world in 1956 when Hill was 13 years old and running errands for various operations at a cab stand across from his home in East New York. Burke was at a card game that night, tipping generously, handing $20 bills to a boy he had never met. Hill remembered the encounter for the rest of his life and described it years later to the journalist Nicholas Pileggi, saying that Burke was giving money to everyone in the room and that he was unlike anyone Hill had ever encountered. Burke saw in the 13-year-old an instinct for locating exploitable angles that was worth cultivating, and he cultivated it deliberately over the following years. Hill became one of the 2 or 3 men closest to the center of everything that came out of Robert's Lounge. Thomas DeSimone was introduced to Paul Vario in 1965 at 19 years old, and Hill described him at that first meeting as a skinny kid in a wise guy suit with a pencil mustache. DeSimone was different from Burke in ways that would matter enormously in the years ahead. He was volatile where Burke was controlled. He killed casually and without the deliberate reasoning that Burke brought to violence. He always carried 2 pearl-handled pistols, which was where the nickname Two-Gun Tommy came from, and his shoes were always immaculately shined, a personal signature specific enough to be memorable to anyone who encountered him. He was useful in the way that a man with no instinctive fear of immediate consequences is useful in operations that require a credible physical threat. He was also a liability in exactly the way that such a man is always eventually a liability. Burke understood both of those things simultaneously and kept using him anyway. The operations that ran out of Robert's Lounge through the 1960s covered the available territory, loan sharking at rates that bore no relationship to anything a bank would offer, gambling in every form available, the fencing of stolen goods through a network that moved merchandise across several states, extortion payments from businesses in the neighborhood that understood paying was preferable to the alternative. Burke also cultivated corrupted law enforcement contacts at multiple levels, and what he told Hill about managing those relationships stuck with Hill for decades. Bribing police officers, Burke explained, was like feeding elephants at the zoo. All it took was peanuts, and the elephants stayed manageable, but the most consistent and most profitable activity the crew ran was the one that the geography made almost inevitable: the Kennedy Airport cargo pipeline. The 5 New York crime families had established interests in the commerce, moving through Kennedy Airport since the airport opened in the 1940s. Luxury goods passed through those terminals constantly: furs, jewelry, electronics, pharmaceutical shipments, currency. The men who controlled the unions governing who loaded and unloaded that cargo, and who had relationships with corrupted officers who looked the other way when trucks were stopped on service roads, had access to a pipeline of untaxed wealth that required very little planning per individual job. Burke's crew was stopping 2 or 3 trucks per week at peak periods. His method had a specific quality to it. He would have the truck pulled over, take the driver's license so the driver could not immediately contact police, hand the driver $50, and send him on his way minus whatever had been in the trailer. The tipping of the drivers, this strange courtesy extended in the middle of a robbery, was where the nickname came from. It was the gesture of a man who ran a business and saw no reason to make that business more violent or more complicated than it needed to be. The job that cemented the reputation of what law enforcement eventually called the Roberts Lounge Group happened not inside a building on Lefferts Boulevard, but inside a cargo terminal a few miles away in April of 1967, and it established a template that Burke would return to 11 years later on a vastly larger scale. The Air France vault at Kennedy Airport held currency of a specific kind: American dollars exchanged in Southeast Asia by United States military personnel and tourists were returned to the country by carriers under contract with American banks, and Air France was one of those carriers through the 1960s. The money traveled in linen bags, each containing $60,000, at volumes sometimes approaching $1 million per week. It was stored in a cement block strong room at Air France's cargo terminal, guarded around the clock by a private security employee whose meal break schedule Robert McMahon knew, because McMahon worked at the Air France cargo terminal and had been introduced to Burke through Henry Hill, In the spring of 1967, McMahon provided the timing. A delivery of between $400,000 and $700,000 in cash was arriving on Friday, April 7th, and the security guard would be on his meal break at just before midnight. Burke assembled a crew and went in. They left with $480,000. What the Air France robbery established, beyond the money itself, was the confirmation of a specific theory of the job. Inside information from a cargo employee was worth more than any amount of external planning. The man who knew the shift schedule, the vault combination, and the guard's rotation could provide access to something that no perimeter surveillance could have revealed. Burke logged that lesson and did not forget it. The years between the Air France robbery and the Lufthansa heist were not idle years, and then a problem arose that would not fully resolve itself for nearly a decade. At a bar called The Sweet in Queens, in the summer of 1970, a Gambino crime family associate named William Bentvena, freshly released from prison, came to a welcome home party that Burke and Hill had organized for him. Bentvena had been a presence in the loan sharking and gambling territory of Queens before his imprisonment, territory Burke had absorbed during his absence. He arrived at the party in good spirits and made a remark to Desimone about whether Desimone still shined shoes, the way he had when he was younger. It was the kind of casual remark men make to each other when they have history and one of them has had enough to drink. For Desimone, it was something that required a permanent response. 2 weeks later, Bentvena was back at the suite and Desimone had arranged for that to happen. Burke kept Bentvena occupied at the bar while Desimone prepared what came next. What happened that night was violent enough that the body had to be driven north, to a property in upstate New York, and buried, and what happened during that drive, when sounds from the trunk revealed Bentvena had survived the initial beating, was worse than what had happened inside the bar. Burke and Desimone buried him. The grave eventually had to be relocated when real estate development threatened to expose it. Bentvena was a made man in the Gambino family. Desimone had not asked anyone's permission. The Gambino family knew what had happened. They were gathering what they needed to respond. The question of that debt and when it would be collected would remain open for 9 years and would eventually produce the most painful and consequential moment in James Burke's professional life. In November of 1972, Burke and Hill were arrested in Tampa, Florida, for the beating of a man named Gaspar Chiacho, who owed a gambling debt to a union official named Casey Rosado, who was connected to the crew. They were convicted of extortion and sentenced to 10 years at the United States Penitentiary at Lewisburg. Burke was paroled after 6 years. He returned to exactly what he had left. The United States Penitentiary at Lewisburg housed enough organized crime figures during the 1970s that the years Burke spent there were never truly a separation from the world he had come from. He served his time alongside men from multiple families, made connections, observed organizational dynamics from inside, and came home in 1978 with a working understanding of what had changed and what had not in his absence. What had changed, in one important respect that would eventually matter enormously, was Henry Hill. Hill had been released approximately 2 years before Burke and had resumed his activities, including drug trafficking that the Lucchese family officially prohibited, but that Hill had learned to expand through contacts made inside Lewisburg itself. Burke understood that the family ban on narcotics existed because drug trafficking sentences were long enough that the people convicted of them had strong incentive to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced exposure. He was watching Hill accumulate exactly that kind of exposure. He kept working with him anyway. Burke also had something in motion that predated his release, and something waiting when he walked out. The Boston College basketball point-shaving scheme had been developing through a gambler named Paul Mazzei and two brothers named Anthony and Rocco Perla, who had a connection to a Boston College basketball player named Rick Kuhn. The plan was to recruit players to keep final scores within a controllable spread, bet accordingly through a network of bookmakers who were in on the arrangement, and collect the profits. Burke and Vario approved the scheme as financial backers. Burke did not think of it as a primary operation. It was a side enterprise running concurrent with the preparation for something larger, and in the months after his release, through a chain of connections he had not initiated and did not control, that larger version came to him. The Lufthansa Airlines cargo terminal at Kennedy Airport received roughly once a month a shipment of American currency that had been exchanged in West Germany by United States military personnel and tourists. Lufthansa flew that currency back across the Atlantic for deposit with American banks. When the armored truck that was supposed to collect it missed its daily window, which happened when late deliveries arrived after the last truck of the day had already departed, the money sat in the terminal vault over the weekend until the following business day. The amounts involved were significant, and the vulnerability was specific and recurring. Paul Vario, who had recently lost a cocaine shipment to law enforcement and needed cash to meet the family's obligations, approved the Lufthansa plan when Burke brought it to him. Burke then assembled the crew and began the planning sessions that would run for months out of Robert's lounge. The information that produced the Lufthansa robbery traveled through 4 people before it reached Burke, and the first person in that chain was not a criminal in any sophisticated sense. Louis Werner was a cargo agent at Lufthansa's terminal at Kennedy Airport who had been losing money at gambling for years, and who owed $20,000 to a bookmaker named Martin Krugman, who ran a men's wig shop in East New York and operated an illegal numbers lottery on the side. Werner had, 2 years earlier in 1976, worked with a co-worker named Peter Gruenwald to steal $22,000 in foreign currency from Lufthansa. That earlier theft had been small enough to go unresolved. What Werner had, beyond that precedent, was comprehensive knowledge of how the terminal worked, the monthly shipment schedule, shift rotations for every employee, the vault's double-door alarm system, the habits of the overnight staff, and access to the building itself through a key he could provide. He told Krugman. Krugman told Hill. Hill brought it to Burke. Burke had long harbored reservations about Krugman as a man whose instinct for discretion did not match the requirements of the work he wanted to be involved in, but the information was specific and the opportunity was large enough that his interest overrode his reservations about the source. He brought the plan to Vario, received the approval he needed, and the planning began. What Werner provided went beyond a tip. He delivered floor plans of the terminal. He explained the shift schedules for every employee who would be on duty overnight when the money was present. He described the vault's double-door alarm system in precise enough detail that the crew could plan exactly what to do when the cargo supervisor was ordered to open it. He provided a key to the outer door of the building, which meant the crew would not be forcing an entrance, but walking through a door that a Lufthansa employee had unlocked for them in advance. Werner's agreed compensation was 10% of whatever the take turned out to be. The crew Burke assembled, Tommy DeSimone, Angelo Sepe, Louis Cafora, Joe Manri, Paolo Licastri, and Robert McMahon, the same Air France cargo employee who had provided the inside information for the 1967 job, and who had been with the crew in various capacities ever since. Frank Burke, Jimmy's son, would drive one of the backup vehicles stationed outside. Parnell Edwards, known as Stax, a blues musician and career criminal, who had been loosely associated with the crew for more than a decade, was assigned to dispose of the getaway van after the money transfer was complete. Individual crew members were promised between $10,000 and $50,000 each, based on the assumption that the haul would come in at around $2 million. The actual take was going to be nearly 3 times that amount. On Saturday, December the 9th, 1978, Werner passed the signal through the chain. A large shipment had arrived at the terminal. The armored truck pickup had been missed. The money was in the vault and would remain there over the weekend. Burke had 2 days to confirm that everything was in position. The van stopped at the gate at 3:12 in the morning on December 11th. One of the crew stepped out and applied bolt cutters to the padlock. They used the key Werner had provided to enter the building. 6 men in ski masks and gloves moved through a facility whose layout they had studied for months toward a vault whose alarm system they could navigate from memory. Within minutes of the entry, all 9 overnight employees had been assembled in the lunchroom and ordered to lie on the floor. The crew's manner was controlled and direct. The men who took them did not shout or threaten beyond what was necessary to communicate their instructions. One supervisor named Kerry Whalen was taken separately and escorted to the vault. He opened the double door system in the required sequence without triggering the alarm, and the room behind the doors held what they had come for: bundled stacks of currency and containers of jewelry. The crew loaded into the van methodically. At 4:21 in the morning, 64 minutes after the van arrived at the gate, it pulled away from the front of the building. The employees had been told not to call the Port Authority police until 4:30. The first emergency call was recorded at 4:30 exactly. The van was gone, carrying $5 million in untraceable cash and $875,000 in jewelry. The crew drove to an auto repair shop in the Canarsie neighborhood of Brooklyn, where Burke was waiting. The boxes came out of the van and went into the trunks of two cars. Burke and his son drove away in one. Four others drove away in the second. Parnell Edwards took the van and was told to drive it to New Jersey, where a junkyard that John Gotti, then a Gambino family captain who shared the airport territory with the Lucchese operation, controlled, would crush it and eliminate whatever physical evidence it carried. Edwards drove to his girlfriend's apartment instead. He parked the van near a fire hydrant. He went inside and did cocaine until he fell asleep. The plates were stolen and the van was impounded. A police officer checking vehicles on the street noticed the van parked too close to the hydrant 2 days after the robbery and ran the plates as a matter of routine. Inside the van, investigators found fingerprints and a footprint impression from a Puma sneaker and ski masks and a leather jacket left behind in the hurry of the transfer. They identified the fingerprints. They connected the van to the robbery. They connected the van, through its occupants, to the crew that operated out of Robert's Lounge, and within 72 hours of the largest cash robbery in American history, the FBI had identified the likely perpetrators with enough specificity to direct a full-scale surveillance operation. What followed was an investigative effort of considerable scope and, in terms of producing a prosecution, almost complete futility. FBI agents ran surveillance around Robert's Lounge using helicopters to follow vehicles and wiretaps installed on the bar's phones and on the payphones nearest to the building. They documented the people who came and went. They recorded fragments of conversation through the background noise of the bar. Angelo Sepe telling an unidentified man about a brown case and a bag from Lufthansa, a fragment confirming what the agents already believed but not providing what they needed. They were watching the right people. What they were not accumulating, in the absence of a witness who would testify and physical evidence traceable to specific individuals inside the terminal, was enough to bring anyone to trial. Burke understood this calculation precisely. He had watched federal cases built and fail against men around him throughout his career, and he knew what the government needed and what it did not yet have. Intelligence was not proof. Converting the first into the second required physical evidence or a cooperating witness, and Burke had the ability to control one of those variables. He assessed the crew members one by one against a single question. Did their continued existence represent more risk than their elimination would cost? In case after case, the answer came out the same way. Vario agreed with his assessment of what had to happen to Edwards. On December 18th, 1978, 7 days after the robbery, Tommy DeSimone and Angelo Seppi went to Edwards' apartment and found him there. DeSimone shot him 5 times in the head at close range. Edwards had a piece of chicken in his mouth at the time of the shooting. He was the first person connected to the Lufthansa robbery to die in its aftermath. He would not be the last. Martin Krugman was the next to disappear. The problem with Krugman was the one Burke had anticipated when Hill first brought him the tip. He was a man who talked more than the situation required, who communicated his expectations too loudly and too frequently, and who had begun demanding his share of the money in a manner that drew attention from people who had no connection to what had happened at the airport. He vanished on January 6th, 1979. His body was never found. Hill later told investigators that Burke and Sepe had killed him and disposed of the remains. The specific circumstances of how the body was handled were never established in any court record, but the conclusion of investigators and of Hill's account was consistent. Krugman had talked too much in a situation where talking too much was a capital offense. Teresa Ferrara was a cosmetologist and part-time cocaine dealer who had frequented Robert's Lounge for years and who had been, At various points, the mistress of DeSimone and of Paul Vario. She was not a member of the crew in any formal sense, but she was connected to the inner circle closely enough to know things that the FBI would have found very useful. In early February of 1979, word reached Burke that Ferrara had met with federal investigators and was providing them with information about the crew's activities. She was killed on February 10th of that year. Her body was dismembered. What remained of her was found floating in the waters near Barnegat Inlet, off the New Jersey coast on May 18th, 3 months after she was killed. Louis Cafora had been in the terminal on the night of the robbery and had received his share of the money. Burke's instruction to all participants in the immediate aftermath was explicit: make no large purchases, draw no attention, behave exactly as they had before the robbery. Cafora, known around the crew as Roast Beef, who weighed approximately 300 pounds and whose presence in any setting was difficult to overlook, purchased a custom-built pink Cadillac for his wife Joanna. He drove that car near the area of the Kennedy Airport cargo terminal, where the FBI investigation was most visible. He told his wife about the robbery and about other matters that fell squarely within the category of things he had been explicitly told not to discuss with anyone. He then attempted to contact the FBI about becoming an informant, which was the decision that finalized his situation. Louis Cafora and his wife Joanna disappeared in March of 1979. Their bodies were never found. Hill later told investigators the two were killed and their remains crushed together with the pink Cadillac at an auto-wrecking facility. Robert McMahon and Joe Manry had been two of the most operationally useful men inside the terminal on the night of the robbery. McMahon's familiarity with airport cargo operations, developed through years at Air France, had made him one of the more trusted figures in the crew going back to the 1967 job. Monry had been responsible for gathering and managing the 9 Lufthansa employees held during the robbery. Both men had legal situations that made them potential subjects of federal pressure. Monry in particular faced an unrelated murder charge in a separate case, which created exactly the kind of sentencing exposure that could be used to encourage cooperation with investigators. In May of 1979, both men were found shot in the back of the head, execution style, in the front seat of a Buick, parked on a Brooklyn street. They were discovered on May 16th. Their bodies had not been hidden. Someone wanted them found. Paolo Licastri was found in June of 1979, his body burned, naked, and shot, left smoldering in a garbage-strewn lot in Brooklyn. Richard Eaton, who had been serving as the visible front of operations at Robert's Lounge and who had been laundering heist money through restaurant and club businesses he operated in Florida, was found hogtied and frozen inside a refrigerated meat truck in that state, discovered by children who came across the vehicle. The murder of Eaton, described in detail by Henry Hill when he testified in federal court years later, was the killing for which Burke was eventually convicted, the conviction that added 20 years to life on top of the sentence he was already serving. By the summer of 1979, 7 months after the robbery, 9 people connected to what happened on December 11th were dead or missing. Hill later described the underlying logic to investigators with directness. Rather than pay each participant $400,000 to $500,000, which was what a fair division of the actual take required, it was easier to put a bullet in their heads. The FBI was watching from helicopters and through wiretaps and through the eyes of surveillance teams that had been on Robert's Lounge since December. They were watching 9 people disappear, and they could not build a prosecution from what they were accumulating, because the man at the center was not the kind of man who left the kind of evidence that produced criminal charges. At Robert's Lounge itself, an earlier generation of what Burke had done there had already been addressed. The bocce court behind the building had once covered the body of Dominic Cersani, strangled by DeSimone with piano wire after he was discovered cooperating with the police on a truck hijacking investigation. The basement floor had once covered Michael Gianco, a bartender shot by DeSimone for a perceived insult during a card game. Both bodies had been moved by the time the FBI eventually obtained a search warrant to examine the premises. Burke had anticipated the search. The man Burke could not protect and could not avenge was the one he had never assessed as a risk. Thomas DeSimone was not killed because of what had happened at the airport. The debt that produced his death was older than the Lufthansa job by nearly a decade, and it was owed not to Burke or to Vario, but to the Gambino family, for the murder of William Benvena in 1970 and for the murder of a Gambino protege named Ronald Girotte in December of 1974. DeSimone had killed both men without authorization. The Gambinos had known for years who had done it. In the late days of December of 1978, they collected. DeSimone was told that the moment he had wanted his entire career had arrived. He was going to be formally inducted into the Lucchese family. He dressed in his finest clothes. He prepared to go where the ceremony would be held. Peter Vario and Bruno Facciolo came to take him. Burke and Hill were in Florida at the time, handling a drug transaction that had gone sideways. Burke called periodically to check on how things were progressing, using the agreed phrase, "Had Tommy seen his godmother yet?" meaning, had the ceremony taken place? The first call came back with the answer that heavy snowfall had postponed the event. Burke called again the following day. What he heard on the second call he received while standing in a phone booth, Hill watching him from outside. He brought the receiver down hard enough that the entire telephone booth shook. He walked out with his eyes wet. He told Hill that the Gambinos had killed DeSimone. In retaliation for the two Gambino men, DeSimone had murdered without permission, and that even he could not avenge it because the commission had approved the killing. It was the only moment in everything that had happened across all the years Hill had known him that Hill saw James Burke cry. Thomas DeSimone disappeared on January 14th, 1979. His wife Angela reported him missing and said she had last seen him a few weeks earlier when he came to borrow $60 from her. His body was never found. He had been, according to Hill's account, in his finest clothes when he was taken, dressed for an induction that was not going to happen. One of the Lufthansa employees interviewed by investigators in the days after the robbery had described a detail that pointed toward DeSimone as a participant. One of the masked men had been wearing unusually polished shoes, a signature that people who knew the crew recognized immediately. The man with the polished shoes was not going to be questioned. He was gone. Louis Werner was convicted in February of 1979, the only person who would ever be held legally accountable for the robbery itself. He was sentenced to 15 years. The limitation of what Werner could offer to investigators was structural. He had never met Burke. He had dealt through Krugman, who was dead, and through Hill, who was not yet cooperating. Werner could confirm his own role in providing the maps, the schedules, and the key, but he could not identify the men who had walked into the terminal with that information in hand. He eventually became an informant after serving roughly a year of his sentence, hoping for earlier release. But the gap between what he knew and what could produce a prosecution of the central figure had always been built into the structure Burke had designed from the beginning. The investigation continued through 1979 and into 1980, the FBI surveillance accumulating without converting to the prosecution the Bureau needed. What the case required, in order to move forward, was something that had not yet materialized. A witness who had been present in the planning sessions at Robert's Lounge, who had sat at the same table as Burke, and who would describe what happened there under oath in a federal courtroom. That witness was still operating in the world in early 1979, still doing what he had always done, still telling himself that the man he had known since he was 13 was not in the process of making the same calculation about him that had been applied to the men who were disappearing. Henry Hill had been the link through which the Lufthansa tip traveled from Werner's world to Burke's. He had sat in the planning sessions and helped structure what happened on December 11th. His knowledge of what followed in the months after the robbery, who had been killed and in what sequence and on whose order and for what stated reason, was comprehensive and personal in a way that no surveillance recording could replicate. He also had a legal problem growing faster than he could manage, and a separate problem he understood, even if he did not name it directly. In the spring of 1980, Hill was arrested by Nassau County authorities on 6 drug-related charges. The sentencing exposure those charges created was serious enough that Hill was looking at prison time measured in decades. He also understood, because he had been paying attention for more than 20 years, that Burke's awareness of his drug activities had been increasing in exactly the way the Lucchese family's ban on narcotics had always predicted would happen, and that Burke's assessment of what to do about a liability who was drawing law enforcement attention was not a theoretical question. On May 27, 1980, Henry Hill signed an agreement with the Federal Strike Force and became a government informant. He entered the United States Marshal's Witness Protection Program with his wife, Karen, and their 2 children. What he told investigators was comprehensive. He described the planning of the Lufthansa Heist across the sessions at Robert's Lounge, the arrival of the tip-through crewmen, the crew Burke assembled, the role Werner played, the role each crew member was assigned, the disposal plan for the van, and what happened when Edwards failed to execute it. He described the murders that followed in the 7 months after the robbery, who was killed, when, how, by whose order, and for what reason in each case. He described the Boston College point-shaving scheme and Burke's central role in backing it. He described the broader network of loan sharking, gambling, hijacking, bribery, and extortion that had run out of Robert's Lounge across 2 decades. His testimony in federal court cases produced 50 convictions in total. Paul Vario, Burke's capo, and the man who had approved the Lufthansa plan, was convicted through Hill's testimony and received 4 years for helping Hill obtain a fraudulent no-show union job used to secure Hill's parole from a previous conviction. Vario died in the late 1980s at the Fort Worth Federal Correctional Institution in Texas. Burke's first conviction from Hill's testimony came in 1982 for his role in the Boston College basketball point-shaving scheme that had been running concurrent with the Lufthansa planning in the 1978-79 season. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Federal prosecutors who discussed the conviction noted its parallel to the 1931 conviction of Al Capone for tax evasion. The government knew what Burke had done, knew the scale of it, knew the murders and the heist and the decades of systematic criminal enterprise, and what it could prove in a federal courtroom, given that the witnesses to the central crimes were either dead or limited by what they had directly known, was something considerably adjacent to the thing itself. Burke was going to prison for fixing college basketball games. While serving that sentence, he was charged with the murder of Richard Eaton. Hill testified at that trial as well. In 1985, Burke was convicted of Eaton's murder and sentenced to an additional 20 years to life. He was never going to walk free again. He would have been eligible for parole no sooner than 2008. He died 12 years before that date arrived. James Burke died on April 13th, 1996, at the Roswell Park Cancer Institute in Buffalo, New York. He was 64 years old. The cause was lung cancer. He had been inside a federal medical facility, which was not entirely unlike every other institutional setting his life had moved through since he was a teenager, and the men who had defined the world he operated in were either dead or imprisoned themselves, or had been the ones who put him there. His son Frank James Burke had been shot dead on May 18, 1987, at 26 years old, outside a bar in East New York, Brooklyn, killed by a drug dealer named Tito Ortiz in an argument that followed from Frank's own drug dealings. The father was in federal prison when that happened and had no available response. The money from the Lufthansa heist was never recovered. Not a dollar of the $5 million in untraceable cash. Not a piece of the $875,000 in jewelry. The cash moved through a network of business investments and cash holdings that dispersed it too thoroughly to trace with the investigative tools available to the FBI in the years immediately after the robbery. Some portion had moved through Richard Eaton's Florida operations before those arrangements ended with Eaton's death. The rest went wherever the proceeds of successful organized crime operations go, into the daily business of the enterprises and the daily lives of the people who held it, converting itself over time into things that are no longer currency and therefore no longer traceable as such. In June of 2013, the FBI and the New York Police Department's Organized Crime Unit excavated the property that had been Burke's former home in Queens. They were looking for human remains. The results were described as preliminary and possibly significant, but the investigation that followed did not produce identifications, connecting specific missing individuals to the site. Martin Scorsese's film Goodfellas had been released in theaters in 1990, adapting Nicholas Pileggi's 1985 book about Henry Hill's life and the world of the Roberts Lounge crew. Burke became Jimmy Conway in the film, played by Robert De Niro, and the portrayal reached an audience that the documentary record of the case had never approached. The film captured something accurate about the original: the generous tipping that produced the nickname, the precise economy with which violence was applied, the way a man could be charming and lethal in the same interaction without those qualities appearing to conflict with each other. What the film's structure could not fully accommodate was the administrative patience of what Burke had actually done in the 7 months after December 11th, the systematic assessment one person at a time of who needed to be removed, and the organized execution of each of those assessments across the spring and summer of 1979. In October of 2014, Vincent Asaro, described by the government as a captain in the Bonanno crime family, was indicted in connection with the Lufthansa Heist, the first arrest connected to the robbery in 36 years. The indictment alleged that Asaro, Burke, and their associates had each expected to receive approximately $750,000 and a quantity of gold jewelry from the proceeds. Asaro was acquitted by a jury in November of 2015, after a defense centering on challenges to the credibility of the government's primary cooperating witness. The acquittal left the Lufthansa case with the same outcome it had carried since February of 1979: one conviction for the man who provided the inside information, who had never met the man who used it. Henry Hill died on June 12, 2012, from a heart failure connected in part to decades of heavy smoking and the physical damage accumulated over a life that had included extraordinary quantities of drugs and alcohol across several decades. He was 69 years old. He had been removed from the Witness Protection Program in 1987 after continuing to commit crimes and attract attention, and he had spent his later years as a figure in the world of true crime media and mob history, giving interviews, making appearances, and eventually co-authoring a book specifically about the Lufthansa heist. He told the story as he had always told it. Burke planned it, Burke ran it, and Burke eliminated nearly everyone who had helped make it happen. He did not know with certainty whether Burke had been moving toward eliminating Hill himself before the arrest forced Hill's hand. He did not believe in the end that Burke would have spared him. There is a specific kind of precision in what James Burke did on December 11th, 1978, and then in the 7 months that followed, and it is not the precision of the robbery itself. The robbery was remarkable for its scale and for the completeness of the inside information that made it possible. But robberies of significant scale have been organized throughout the history of crime in this country. What was different about the Lufthansa job, and what has made it endure in the way that it has, is the totality of what surrounded it. A man who was never charged with the crime he organized. A crime in which the only conviction was the airport employee who had never met the organizer. An investigation that identified the right people within 72 hours and then spent years watching witnesses disappear while the evidence that might have supported a prosecution was systematically eliminated. A crew assembled with precision in the months before December 11th and then dismantled with the same precision in the months after, by the same hand that assembled it, leaving behind almost no cooperating witnesses and no physical trail that connected the elimination campaign to the man who ordered it. What the story reveals about the world that produced it is something specific. Organized crime in the late 1970s had developed operational methods sophisticated enough that the traditional tools available to federal law enforcement could be defeated if the man at the center was disciplined enough to eliminate the cooperation before it could be offered. Burke was that disciplined. The cost of that discipline was 9 people dead in 7 months. The result was that the man who organized the largest cash robbery in American history never answered for it in any federal courtroom. He died in April of 1996 in a cancer facility in Buffalo, serving a sentence for fixing college basketball games and for the murder of a man who had been laundering his money. The $5 million has not been found. The $875,000 in jewelry has not been found. The Lufthansa case remains technically open. and the record set on a December morning inside a cargo terminal at Kennedy Airport in 64 minutes by 6 men in ski masks who walked through a door that a Lufthansa employee had unlocked for them in advance has never been broken.